Um, so if I look different today, it's because yesterday was my birthday. So I'm looking forward to entering my 35th year. So it's just I know close, getting old, but what can I say? Speaking of things that happened on or about this date, notice that smooth segue. It was today in 600 A.D. Pope Gregory the Great, who John Calvin referred to as the last good pope. Okay, he was he's one of the saints, popes who became a saint. He's the pope that sent Augustine to Canterbury, as in Augustine of Canterbury, not to be confused with Augustine of Hippo. Augustine of Canterbury, the first Archbishop of Canterbury. Um, he is the patron saint of musicians and teachers. But it was on this date in 600 AD that Pope Gregory the Great decreed that God bless you is the correct response to a sneeze. Just so you know. So, hey, we don't mess with Pope Gregory the Great, okay? I'm sorry, I'm just telling you. I'm just reporting the news, okay? So it was on this date in 1659 that the first known check was written. It was for 400 pounds, and it was written in England, and it is currently in the British Museum. I think they're waiting to see if the funds have cleared, something like that. In 1751, Thomas Gray's poem "Elegy in a Country Churchyard" was published. I don't know if any of you have ever read that. You probably have. In 1874, Thomas Wolfe wrote a book called "Far from the Madding Crowd," which came from that poem. It's one of the lines of the poem. It's also the poem that has the line, "The paths of glory lead but to the grave." So, being Mr. Obituary, as I am accused, this is one of my favorite 18th century poems. But it's on this date in 1852 that Charles Taze Russell was born. Charles, name ring a bell to anyone? Charles Taze Russell. He founded a Bible school movement, which is still around today, although we don't call it the Bible school movement. We call it the Jehovah's Witnesses. So the Charles Taze Russell, who ostensibly is the founder of the Jehovah's Witnesses, was born on this day. Robert Ketchum was converted on this date in 1910. Any Robert Ketchum fans in the room? Check with those of you who went to Baptist universities. Robert Ketchum wasn't the founder, but he was the early leader of the General Association of Regular Baptists, which was sort of a not a splinter group, but it was a reaction group to the fundamentalist movement of the 1920s. They said, okay, we don't want to go quite that far, but we're not on this side, so that we're just regular Baptists. Our church is not a part of, and it's still around, a GARB church, General Association of Regular Baptists. The closest one I know is Bible Baptist Church in Romeoville. If anyone's familiar with that one, that was a GARB church. I think it still is, although I'm not really sure if that church is still in operation or not. But that was a GARB church. But he was converted on this date in 1910. In 1911, the hymn "Rise Up, O Men of God" was published. Dun, 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 all together now. Dun, 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 dun. Okay, there you go. Right, that was published on this date, written by William Merrill, was published on this date in 1911. In 1923, King Tut's tomb was opened. How many have seen King Tut or the King Tut exhibit, or you remember that, or at least heard the song? One of those. King Tut's tomb was discovered on this date in 1923. In 1963, Hannah Arendt published her account of the Adolf Eichmann trial. Hannah Arendt was a philosopher who wrote many things, but she was the one who, talking about Adolf Eichmann, who was one of the engineers, architects of the movement to eliminate the Jewish population in World War II. And she was talking, and she's the one that coined the phrase "the banality of evil." And the talk was that when you think of someone that's evil, you want to see somebody that looks evil, and he just looked normal, and he just seemed like a normal looking guy. She did the banality of evil was coined in the publication on this date. And finally, where were you on this night in 1964? We know where Ed was because he missed it last week. So tonight he was watching the second time the Beatles were on the Ed Sullivan Show, kind of thing. It was funny that, I don't know if any of you noticed, that we talked about the Beatles being on the Ed Sullivan Show last week, and then Pastor Jarrett talked about the Beatles in the church service. We don't usually coordinate like that, but so if today he talks about elegy written in a country churchyard, there's something. I had to text him. I said, hey, it was on this date in 1964. Then I had to explain who Ed Sullivan was and what the TV was and what a television show was, because, you haven't figured that out about Pastor Jarrett. Any pop culture reference to the 20th century is, forget it. Just, it doesn't land. Okay, so you can't make jokes about, Saturday morning cartoons or any of that, because it just doesn't work. But yeah, that's it. That's it for today. So again, next time you hear somebody sneeze and you say God bless you, you'll know it was because of Pope Gregory the Great. All right, 1 Samuel 27. Last week we ended with the last time that David and Saul meet up, the last confrontation between the two. And once again, Saul has promised David that he will not harm him, that you're going to succeed, you're going to be king. He recognizes this, and he sends him on his way. And then in chapter 27, when we ended with this, moving into chapter 27, I read the first verse there. But David thought to himself, one of these days I will be destroyed by the hand of Saul. The best thing I can do is to escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will give up searching for me anywhere in Israel, and I will slip out of his hand. So our first thing is, moving into chapter 27, Saul doesn't believe that Saul will stop chasing him, so he escapes to the land of the Philistines. Now this is an interesting thing here. This is an interesting switch. Remember, we talked several weeks ago about the way that the narrative is moved forward in Samuel. And we said that the writer focuses on conversation. The conversation moves the narrative along. And sometimes it's conversation between two people. Other times he uses internal monologue. And whenever you do that, there's a certain level of credibility to everything. When the author quotes someone as saying something, that has a certain level of credibility as far as whether it's accurate or true. But when the author specifically says this is why someone did it, that's your highest credibility as far as why something worked. An internal monologue is just the way that the author kind of moves the story along. And so we see that a lot, except we don't see it for David, except for here. So this is the only time we see an internal monologue of David, where David thought to himself, this is what I'm going to do. Okay. Now this makes an interesting thing, because you'll notice what's not here in this particular passage. There's no indication that David inquires of the Lord as far as whether this is a good idea or not. And notice all the other times you see David inquiring of the, he's got a priest with him, he's got the ephod, he's got a prophet with him. There's no indication that David goes to any length to find out whether this is a good idea or not. Now, one of the things that happens especially when we read narrative text, is we tend to get so used to the story that we assume everything that happens is the way that it was intended to happen, and that's not necessarily true. The best example of that is the clearest example is when people talk about Rahab in Joshua chapter 2, I think it is, where the spies go into Jericho. They go around, and then they hide in Rahab's house, and the people come knocking on Rahab's door. The men of the city come knocking on Rahab's door and say, hey, where are those two spies we say come in here? And Rahab flat out lies. She says, oh, they left. And so the people say, okay, and they leave. And so there's this tendency, and I heard this on a couple of occasions, where there's justification. Well, this lying is okay, and because it saved these two spies, or however many spies there were. And whereas the fact is, those two spies were going to get back because God wanted them to get back. And I believe that Rahab could have said, oh yeah, they're here. They're right there. And they would have gotten away somehow because that's what God wanted to do. Okay. And so we look at this and think, okay, well, this is David's time going into to go over to the Philistines. This is apparently part of God's plan. And I'm going to think, I don't think it is. See, we can do this with the text because this is just a narrative, right? Samuel is not written here to say, okay, if you're going to be a Christian, you have to spend 1 year and 4 months in the enemy's territory. No, this is just telling what David did. And I think this was a bad idea, that I don't think David needed to do this. Okay. He didn't need to go over to the Philistines. He was God's anointed, and God was going to protect him. Okay. So what happens then, and it'll become interesting, and remind me if I forget to draw because I spilled this to Debbie already. The conclusion. Now, to a certain extent, I'm speculating here. Maybe it was what God wanted. But all the other times we see David inquiring with the Lord, but not here. Okay, not here. Okay, so there's no indication that David inquired of the Lord about this move. Notice how I cleverly put in that on your handout there. Okay, so in verse 2, so David and the 600 men with him left and went over to Achish, son of Maach, king of Gath. Okay, so David and his 600 men went over to Gath, the original home of Goliath. So do you think they don't know who David is there? Okay, now we've already met Achish once. If you remember back a few chapters, in chapter 20, so again, David was running from Saul. He had just gone and he goes over to Achish, but he's by himself. Okay, now he's by, and so he's drooling and acting like a crazy guy. And Achish says, don't I have enough crazy people around here that you bring this guy to me? And even his servants that come to him say, this is David, of whom they say David has killed his thousands and Saul has killed his thousands, David has killed his 10,000s. This is him. And Achish says, why are you bringing this guy to me? Okay, I don't really want to deal with him. Now suddenly, Achish is interested to see him because now David is coming over. He apparently has gotten over the whole drooling on himself, but he has 600 fighting men with him. Okay, so this is kind of a small army that he's got with him, and Achish is like, cool. Yeah, I can use you. I know this is think, wow, this is why would they do this? Why would he do this? I know there's a one of Shakespeare's lesser performed plays is a play called Coriolanus. It was also the last play in our quest to see all of Shakespeare's plays live. We flew to New York to see Ralph Fiennes play Coriolanus at the Brooklyn Academy of Music. Got our car towed by the New York Towing Company, and it was exciting. It was fun. But in Coriolanus is a Roman general, and he's a victorious Roman general, and he has this great victory, and he comes back to Rome, and they want to make him the Roman consul, which is like a ruling position. But in order to do that, he has to appeal to the common people, which he just can't do. Okay, he's not a pleasant guy. Not at all, right? And it's at one point, one of the great lines is, as an insult, he says, "You do infect the air I breathe." Kind of just a great line. And I'm not suggesting at all that Debbie has ever used that line on me more than a few times. I'm sorry, no. But she does have it on a t-shirt. So I know when she's wearing that t-shirt, it's like, don't mess with Debbie today kind of thing. That's her, subtle messages that you pick up after a while. But he can't do this, and the people get mad at him, and so he has just had this great victory over the Volscians. It's not Vulcans, the Volscians or something like that. And part of the story is, well, the Romans kick him out, so he goes over to fight with the Volscians, and they go, sure, come on over, you can fight with us. And there's even there's another Shakespeare play, King Henry VI, which is very hard the plays to see live, where the one character goes back and forth going from one side to the other. And this was, even in the Wars of the Roses, you saw these people going back and forth on the sides. Okay, so I mean that's Shakespeare writing in the 17th, 16th century, but even still, it's like, yeah, okay, we believe you. We know Saul doesn't want you. We know Saul is going to kill you. So okay, we can use you. So David and his men settled in Gath with Achish. Each man had his family with him. And David had his two wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail of Carmel, the widow of Nabal. When Saul was told that David had fled to Gath, he no longer searched for him. So David was right. If Saul knew that David left the country, Saul wasn't going to look for him anymore. Okay, so he was right. Okay, so he got what he wanted. Now he's there with his two wives, and then as he's got these 600 men and all of their families. So he comes, and David said to Achish, if I have found favor in your eyes, let a place be assigned to me in one of the country towns, that I may live there. Why should your servant live in the royal city with you? So keep in mind, David and his men are in his group now. There's wives and family, so there's like, who knows, maybe another 1,000. It's 1,000 people. It's 1,500 people. That's a lot of people to suddenly move in, right? I mean, imagine if Downers Grove, if 1,500 people suddenly showed up and said, "Hey, we need a place to live." Okay. Well, David realizes he probably doesn't want to be too close to Achish. He doesn't want to cause too much trouble because he is still an outsider. Okay, he is still a Jew. He is still a Hebrew, an Israelite there. And so he says, let me have a place, maybe a little further out, so I'm not really in your way. And so that day, Achish gave him Ziklag, okay, which is a city, he says Ziklag, and it's belonged to the kings of Judah ever since. David lived in Philistine territory 1 year and 4 months. Okay, so it says David and his 600 men went over to Gath, etc. Every man has his family, and David has his two wives with him. Because you remember his first wife, Michal, has been taken away, so to speak, by Saul. Saul has given her to someone else. Okay, we're going to come back to that later. Hold that thought. We're going to come back to that later. Okay, wary of being too near Achish, David asks for and receives Ziklag for his home. So he and all of his entourage go over to this Ziklag, which is in the southwest area of, I had it on the map. If you remember this little map that we had here, this is Ziklag is right here, right where my fingers, that's where Ziklag is, okay, or where they believe Ziklag is. So he goes to live in this Ziklag, okay? So far, so good. But, David has got to do some stuff. He's got to keep himself busy. So what happens is, now David and his men went up and raided the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites. Okay, so David and his men raided 3 main areas: the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites. Now, if you think about the Geshurites, this is a group that the Israelites first ran into in Joshua, and I think I have the text there, in Joshua 13. Okay, the Girzites we don't know anything about, and the Amalekites, of course, these were the people group that was the cause of Saul's downfall. As you may recall, that Saul was told to go out and destroy the Amalekites, and he doesn't, and Samuel comes back in 1 Samuel 15, says, what is the sound of bleeding I hear? So he goes out and he develops this, let me rephrase this. Let me point this out, that these guys are not, they're mutual enemies of both the Philistines. They're not Philistines, but they're enemies of the Philistines. Or at least not friends of the Philistines, and are certainly enemies and problems to the Jews, to the nation of Israel, or the land of Israel at this point. Okay, so what David does, he has this plan. He says, okay, I'm going to live here in the Philistine area, and I'm going to go attack these mutual enemies, these common enemies of both the Philistine and Israel, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to lie to Achish about what I'm doing. That's what he's doing, right? He says, now David and his men went up and raided them. From ancient times, these peoples had lived in the land extending to Shur in Egypt. Whenever David attacked an area, he did not leave a man or a woman alive. This is kind of brutal. He doesn't leave a man or woman alive, but took the sheep and cattle and donkeys and clothes and camels. Then he returned to Achish. When Achish asked, "Where did you go raiding today?" David would say, "Against the Negev of Judah." That's the desert area of Judah. Okay, the Negev is that southern desert area. So David is lying to Achish. He's telling Achish, "Oh, I'm fighting the Jews. I'm fighting your enemies." Okay. He doesn't tell him, "I'm fighting the Geshurites," or, "I'm not touching the Jews. I'm fighting the Geshurites." He doesn't say, "I'm fighting the Girzites. I'm fighting the Amalekites." He leads Achish on to think that he's doing something else. So again, this is like, okay, why? And so he kills all these people because he doesn't want his cover to be blown. Okay. He did not leave a man or woman alive, for he thought, again, here's David's internal thought again, they might inform on us and say, "This is what David did." And such was his practice as long as he lived in the Philistine territory. So he goes there on his, again, he goes there figuring, okay, this is how I'm going to keep myself safe. I'm going to go attack these individual, these people groups, and I'm going to kill everyone. But I'm going to take all of their stuff, all of their riches, their cattle, their goods. I'm going to kill everyone, men and women, so nobody can say exactly what I was doing. Okay, so this is not, to me, this is, again, this is not David's finest moment. Okay, I'm like, okay, there's it could be, if they're common enemies, why not just say, "I'm fighting these common enemies"? But he doesn't. He intentionally misleads Achish as far as what he's up to. Okay, so again, this is sort of, I mean, I get that David is God's chosen, he's the anointed, and he's the exemplar king. Okay, but I think the bigger picture, we start thinking about David and some of the things he did. And one of the, we have this view of David and we say, "Oh, David is this great. He had this one little slip with Bathsheba, but other than that, everything was great." Like, yeah, no. Okay. David was a brutal, vicious guy who was used to figuring out how he was going to get what he needed to do here. Okay. Again, I don't think, to put it one way, I don't think he's in God's will here. Okay. Now, this is speculation on my part. You can disagree with me if you want. Okay. You can come in next week with a T-shirt that says, "You do infect the air I breathe." That's okay. You can do that. That's fine. But I'm like, this is not David's finest hour. Okay. And he says, he did not say, "Leave a man or woman," or they might inform on us and say, "This is what David did." And such was his practice as long as he lived in the Philistine territory. And Achish trusted David and said to himself, "He has become so obnoxious to his people, the Israelites, that he will be my servant for life." Okay. Now, you could argue that David is at war. And all's fair in love and war, right? Well, okay, that's really not true if you think about it. All is not fair in love and war. There are rules and strictures and all that kind of stuff as far as when you're at war. But it's interesting that now Achish trusts David because he's been lying to him about what he's been doing. And he's been very brutally killing all of these people. Now, you could say, well, if he had stayed, Saul would have still looked for him. That's true. That's probably true. Okay. But then again, there's another line in this time it's in Hamlet. This is a heavy Shakespeare day. I'm just letting you know. In Hamlet, where Laertes, who is the son of the Polonius, who was killed by Hamlet, who comes to wreak vengeance on Claudius, who's the king. And the queen is trying to get Laertes, and I forget the exact line, but Claudius says to the queen, "Let him go. He, there's a protection. God protects kings," which is really ironic because Claudius has, well, I don't want to give away the plot of Hamlet, but then just trust me, it's ironic what he says. God's going to protect me. I'm the king. So it's like, well, if God wanted you to be the king, you're going to be the king. Okay, if God anointed you to be the king, if that was what God wanted you to do, then that's this was going to happen. Achish trusted David and said to himself, he has become so obnoxious to his people because as far as Achish knows, he's out there killing Israelites. He's fighting the Philistines' battles. Okay? And there's nobody telling him different. Why? Because they're all dead. So David is doing a lot of killing here. Okay? Now, fast forward, I'm going to just kind of really fast forward a bit because most of us are fairly familiar with the story. Much later in his life, David is going to want to build a temple for God. He builds a palace, and then he says, why should I live in a house when you're living in a tent? I'm going to build this palace for God. And he's told this is in Kings, I think it is, or maybe it's in Chronicles, you can't build a palace. I don't want you to build a palace because there's too much blood on your hands. Now, most of the time, if you're just kind of the basic, you think, oh, well, we're talking about Uriah, and that is perfectly okay, all right, because obviously Uriah does die at his hand. Again, I hope I'm not giving away anything about what's going to happen in 2 Samuel. But, here's an example of there's a lot of people dying here just to keep David safe. Okay, is it really necessary to kill all the women? Okay, they're not part of the army. Okay, again, speculation on my part, but I'm like, what's he doing there? Okay. In those days, verse 1 of chapter 28, in those days the Philistines gathered their forces to fight against Israel. Okay, this is something that happened on a regular basis. Achish said to David, you must understand that you and your army will accompany me, you and your men will accompany me in the army. So now Achish is like making it clear to David that, hey, I know what you've told me, but now you're gonna join me. You're gonna fight next to me in the army. And David gives this really weird reply. David said, then you will see for yourself what your servant can do. Okay. Is he saying, oh yeah, I'm ready to kill some Israelites? Like, no, what's David planning on doing? David is now suddenly, he's going to be in front of Achish. What's he going to do? What's his plan? David is in a quandary. He's in a spot. Okay. Achish replied, very well, I will make you my bodyguard for life. So David's practice was to kill everyone, man and woman, take the booty, and then lie to Achish about where he had attacked. Achish trusted David, thinking David had become obnoxious to his own people. Eventually, the Philistines, that's what the P's are, gathered to attack Israel, and Achish called for David to join him. David seems willing to assist. You will see for yourself what your servant can do. Okay, it's like kind of something, you say to are you going to, I remember telling my kids, are you going to mow the lawn today? And they tell me, you will see for yourself what your son will do. And I'll let you decide what, pardon me? Can't say one way or the other because, just kidding. I'm kidding, Silas. I'm kidding. But it's just this really enigmatic kind of reply. But Achish is willing to go with it. Says, very well, I will make you my bodyguard for life. Now, this is kind of interesting. Making my bodyguard. Okay, why does he make him his bodyguard? Why does he make David his bodyguard? Well, he trusts David. Okay, he trusts David more than he trusts his own people. He figures that if anybody's going to want to kill him, they're going to have to get through David. Or maybe he doesn't trust David. Maybe in another... I believe Shakespeare wrote The Godfather. I don't know. But there's a famous line from The Godfather, you keep your friends close and your enemies closer. Maybe, I don't know, that could be whatever. But he's like, okay, Achish is going to have David right there. Now, I'm wondering if David is panicking at this point, thinking, wait a minute, it's going to be kind of hard for me to cover up my gig with Achish right there. Meanwhile, we'll come back to this because now we go to another story. Now Samuel was dead. This is where I do the other. Did Shakespeare write A Christmas Carol? I'm sorry. Marley was dead to begin with. That is very important that you understand. So if If you ever read A Christmas Carol, you know that Marley was dead. And Dickens makes a big point. You have to understand Marley is dead. Because if you don't believe Marley is dead, none of this is going to make any sense. So here, this is our second time we've been reminded. Samuel is dead. Kaput. He's ex, late, former. Okay. And all Israel had mourned for him and buried him in his hometown of Ramah. Okay, so meanwhile, in case you forgot, Samuel was dead. Also, meanwhile, Saul had evicted all the mediums and spirits from the land. Saul had expelled the mediums and spirits from the land. Now, this is a very good thing. Okay, so if you think Saul was a bad king that he never tried, here's an example. I mean, because Exodus 18 and several other passages, you know, that shall not suffer a witch to live, kind of thing. There's several other Old Testament messages where very clearly God told the Israelites, don't traffic with spiritists or mediums or witches or anything like that. Okay, just don't have anything to do with it one way at all. So this is a good thing. Okay, so he had done this good thing as king, and probably it was a well-known ruling that he had made. This wasn't like a secret thing that he had said to somebody in the past, but this is a well-known thing. The Philistines assembled and came and set up camp at Shunem, while Saul gathered all Israel and set up camp at Gilboa. When Samuel saw the Philistine army, he was afraid. Terror filled his heart. Now, this is interesting. Now, Saul has been the king for many years at this point. I mean, one of the other passages says that he had been king for 40 years. So we're nearing, newsflash, we're nearing the end of Saul's kingship. I was going to say his presidency. His president, king, I get those two confused. He's ending the year, near the end of his reign. And all he's done is fight the Philistines. Now, this time, he sees the Philistine army and he's filled with terror. Okay, no other time do we hear that Saul is filled with terror when he faces the Israelite army. Or when he faces the Philistine army. What's changed? What's different this time? Pardon me? Well, Samuel is dead, but what's changed about the Philistine army? It includes David. And I think Saul knows at this point that David is in that army. The guy that the Lord said is going to take over from me, the guy who has killed his tens of thousands, is now fighting against me. Terror would probably fill your... And notice what Saul does. He inquires of the Lord. Okay, the only person inquiring of the Lord here is Saul, not David. Okay, Saul inquires of the Lord, but the Lord did not answer him by dreams or Urim or prophets. Okay, any of the ways that we could have heard that that David could have replied, he doesn't. Saul's trying everything, and he can't get a word in from the Lord. He's got this army that he's looking at this thing, and I'm doomed. This is not going to end well for me. Okay. Saul then said to his attendants, "Find me a woman who is a medium, so I may go and inquire of her." There is one in Endor, they said. Now, I think this is interesting. Saul sees the assembled army in terror, and terror fills his heart. Why? Perhaps this time he knows that the army against him includes David. Saul inquires of the Lord, but the Lord does not answer him. Saul tells his people, "Find me a medium," and surprisingly, they know where one is. I just think that, this thing that's outlawed, hey, I need to find one of these outlawed. Oh yeah, there's one. Yeah, just so go down the road, make a left at the 7-Eleven, and it's right there. They know where this medium is. Okay, which to me is kind of like if I'm Saul, I'm thinking, wait a minute, how do you know that? How do you know where this medium is? Don't you But he doesn't say that because he's desperate. So Saul disguised himself, putting on other clothes. Okay, so perhaps he had his royal robe on, the one that's David cut the corner out of. Maybe it's been fixed, but he puts on non-royal robe. He's still kind of recognizable. Why? He's tall. He's still a head taller than everyone else in Israel. But he's still tall. Saul then said to his attendants, find me a woman. There's one in Endor. So Saul disguised himself, putting on other clothes. And at night, he and 2 men went to the woman. Consult a spirit for me, he said, and bring up for me the one I name. Okay. Now it's mentioned that people who did this usually had like a pit, that there's something that they're calling up, bringing up out of this pit, that they would have this pit, and the charade or the thing was that out of this pit would come the person, that they would come and stand, and out of this pit would come the person. So he says, consult the spirit for me and bring up who I say. So where am I? So Saul disguised himself and bring up the woman. But the woman said to him, surely you know what Saul has done. He has cut off the mediums and spiritists from the land. Why have you set a trap for my life to bring about my death? Okay, now this is an odd thing to say for somebody who apparently everybody knows is a medium. Why does she decide to say, listen, Saul has, it suggests to me she knows who Saul is. She knows there's something weird about this. You don't usually get 3 men in the middle of the night coming up and saying, hey, bring the spirit. I think she knows something is up. She may not realize it's Saul. Maybe she does. Okay. But Saul swore to her by the Lord, as surely as the Lord lives, you will not be punished for this. This is an interesting statement. Okay. He's promising on the Lord's life not to punish the woman for doing what the Lord forbid. Okay. So it's like, okay, wait a minute. The Lord said no. Why is the Lord going to protect me from doing what he said? No. Okay. But it's like, this is actually, if nothing else, this to the woman is a promise that nothing's going to happen to her. Okay. Why? Perhaps this time, let's see. Saul tells his medium, they know where one is. Saul, disguised along with 2 others, visit the woman and make their demand. The woman resists, accusing the men of setting a trap. Saul ironically swears on the Lord's life that the woman won't be punished for doing what the Lord has explicitly prohibited multiple times. This is Exodus 22:18, 19:31. So then the woman asks, whom shall I bring up for you? Bring up Samuel, he said. When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out at the top of her voice and said to Saul, why have you deceived me? You are Saul. Okay. So let's see. When the woman resists, Saul ironically swears. Saul asks the woman. Saul apparently recognizes Samuel and realizes that Saul is the one asking. Okay. That's one way to look at it. Now, before we get in, further, well, wait. He says, where'd I go? Where have you deceived me? The king said to her, don't be afraid. What do you see? So Saul doesn't see what the woman sees. And she says, an old man in a robe. An old man wearing a robe is coming up, he said, which is actually the description on my business card. Stan Ray, old man wearing a robe. Or actually, that's what Debbie started calling me this morning. Since yesterday was my birthday, she says, now, you have now reached the point where you're just an old man wearing a robe. That's what's on my t-shirts, old man wearing a robe. That's all she says. But from that, Saul goes, oh, that must be Samuel. Okay, so it's interesting. Saul, what do you see? I see a ghostly figure coming up out of the earth. What does he look like, he asked. An old man wearing a robe is coming up. Then Saul knew it was Samuel, and he bowed down and prostrated himself with his face to the ground, which suggests that he's not looking at Samuel. Okay, maybe he realizes, okay, maybe I've crossed the line here. I don't know. Maybe it's gone a little bit too far. So she apparently recognizes Samuel and realizes that Saul is the one asking. Her description, an old man wearing a robe, is enough to convince Saul that Samuel has entered the room. Saul bows down and prostrates himself face down. Does he ever look? I don't know. We don't know. Okay. Now we're to page 2. Okay. Samuel's message is, to put it lightly, blunt, or bleak, or bad. It's all kinds of different ways. I started with bleak, then I realized there are all kinds of ways to say negative things using the letter B. So fill in one, pick one you like. Okay. Samuel's response to her is, Samuel says, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? I am in great distress," Saul said. "The Philistines are fighting against me, and God has departed from me. He no longer answers me either by prophets or by dreams, so I have called on you to tell me what to do." Okay. Samuel said, "Why do you consult me now that the Lord has departed from you and become your enemy?" Okay, so things have kind of moved on since Samuel just said that the kingdom has been torn away from you. He didn't say before that the Lord is now your enemy. Maybe he's talking about David being on the other side. Perhaps that now you're fighting your own people. Okay. "The Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hands and given it to one of your neighbors, to David." So he says, "Why do you contact me?" Point now. Okay. "The Lord has departed from you and become your enemy." David with the Philistines. Remember, the Lord has taken the kingdom from you. This is the second time he's told that. But the first time, in chapter 15, he says, "The Lord has taken the kingdom from you and given it to one of your neighbors, to one better than you." That's from 15:28. That's what Saul was told by Samuel in chapter 15, verse 28, after the Amalekite disaster. Now he says the exact same thing, except he says, "Remember, the Lord has taken the kingdom from you and given it to one of your neighbors, to David." Okay, so now explicitly, Saul is told by Samuel that the guy on the other side is going to take the kingdom from you. Okay, this is not the message I think Saul was hoping for. Okay. "It's because you failed your mission with the Amalekites." Where am I? "Because you did not obey the Lord or carry out his fierce wrath against the Amalekites, the Lord has done this to you today." Then he says, the Lord will deliver three things. It's because you failed. Tomorrow the Lord will deliver you and your sons. I'm sorry. The Lord will deliver both Israel and you into the hands of the Philistines. And tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. The Lord will also give the army of Israel into the hands of the Philistines. Okay. So tomorrow the Lord will deliver both you, Saul, and Israel into the hands of the Philistines. You and your sons will be with me, as in die. The army will be captured, and the army will be captured. Okay. Saul collapses. Now, apparently at this point, Samuel disappears. That's it. Samuel's done. Drops the mic, walks out of the building. He's done. He said all that he has to say. Immediately Saul fell full length on the ground, filled with fear because of Samuel's words. His strength was gone, for he had eaten nothing all day. Now, some have looked at this and said that Saul had this weird habit, and we know from chapter 14 where he had told everybody don't eat the day of the battle. So some have suggested that maybe that's what it is. He just has this thing of not eating on the day of battle. But whatever, he hasn't eaten all day. He's just been given the worst news you could possibly get. I mean, can it get any worse? You're going to die. Your kids are going to die. Your lifelong job is you're going to fail at the one thing you were told to do. Protect from the Philistines. Not only are they going to win, they're going to capture the army. They're going to kill you and your sons. He gets the worst news possible. He falls, passes out, okay, out of hunger. Immediately Saul fell. His strength was gone. Verse 21. When the woman came to Saul and saw that he was greatly shaken, she said, "Look, your servant has obeyed you. I did what you told me to do. I took my life in my hands and did what you told me to do. Now please listen to your servant and let me give you some food so you may eat and have the strength to go on your way." Now maybe this woman is afraid of the king of Israel dying in her thing. Oh, I forgot to mention Endor. She's at Endor. Endor is where in the Old Testament, this is where Jael and Sisera jail with the nail. It's the same place where this famous death had occurred. She said, and maybe she's afraid of this. So she said, I got to feed this guy. He's got to eat something. He refused and said, I will not eat. Okay. But his men joined the woman in urging him, and he listened to them. He got up from the ground and sat on the couch. Now, what's interesting here is in verse 24, it says, the woman had a fatted calf at the house, which she butchered at once. She took some flour, kneaded it, and baked bread without yeast. Now, how long do you suppose that took? Okay, this is not just a matter of taking something out of the freezer and putting it in the microwave. Hey, just wait 60 seconds, I'll have something for you. This is a major meal. She's got to go out there and kill and dress a cow. She's got to cook it, fix it. He's there for a while. Okay, he's there for a long period of time, several hours, just sitting there, contemplating what's going on. Then she set it before Saul and his men, and they ate. That same night, they got up and left. Okay, so she gives him enough food, he gets up and leaves. Okay. So Saul collapses due to fear because he has not eaten all day. The woman offers to feed him, and urged on by his men, he eats. All right, now, excursus time. I just like that word, excursus. It's sort of it's a fancy way of saying rabbit trail. This witch at Endor, okay, is this a real thing? And what I mean by that is, because if you think about it, if it's a real thing, does that mean that there are people out there who can summon the dead? Well, it happened in the Old Testament. Is this a real thing? Okay. Yes, no, maybe. Well, some have argued that no, it's all in Saul's imagination. That Saul is just thinking about this whole thing, because we know Saul is not okay in the head. He's got some issues. Maybe it's being bipolar. Maybe he has some serious, what we would call mental health issues. Now that it's all something in his head. Okay. There's no indication of the text that that's what it is. You kind of have to draw some conclusions there. But I say yes. The text clearly indicates it is. The text never says that's not Samuel. They make it clear. Samuel is dead. Now Samuel is talking. Okay, so the writer is pretty clear. That's Samuel he's talking about. Okay. Samuel's message is consistent. In fact, he doesn't say anything that he hasn't already said, except to say that the kingdom is going to David and not to one of your neighbors. Everything he said is something he has said before. Okay. Okay. So he doesn't change the message. He doesn't give something different. He doesn't sugarcoat it. He doesn't tell Saul what he wants to hear. Okay. So the message is consistent with everything that Samuel has said before. Okay. And there are New Testament examples. Okay. If you go to Matthew 17, Mark 8, Luke 9, you have the Transfiguration. And in the Transfiguration, what do the apostles, disciples see? They see Jesus transfigured, and they see Elijah and Moses talking to Jesus. Okay, so, well, is that real? Is that in the apostle or the disciples' mind? So, okay, well, yeah, so I think it's a real thing. Now, if that's a real thing, does that mean now that there are mediums out there who could bring up the dead? Okay, it's like, well, cool, because I would really like to ask this person some questions, Not necessarily. So I'm going to go with a no on that, because the woman seems surprised that someone came up. Okay. She just sees, that she doesn't know what Samuel looks like. She doesn't say it's Samuel. She's surprised. She cries out with a voice, whoa, wait. Something came up. And this is just God's one-off time saying, I need to get a message to Saul. And if I need to bring back Samuel in this, if you're talking about a God who can create the universe out of nothing, well, this is not that big a stretch. Okay. So the woman's surprise suggests anyone actually appearing was a surprise to her. It's possible this is a one-time event for Saul's, and I'm going to use the word here loosely, benefit. Okay. Now, Is it possible? I suppose anything's possible. Okay. Is it possible that the Lord could bring somebody from the dead to give us a message? Based on what Samuel's message here is, I wouldn't want to go that route. You know, so don't expect that he's going to tell you anything that hasn't already been told. So I think that this is a real event. I think it is just like the text says it is, but I think it's an example of a one-time event where the Lord needed to get a message to Saul, or wanted to get this message to Saul. And I think, part of this is this didn't have to happen. This didn't have to happen. And this is speculation on my part that, the ending of Saul's kingdom did not result in a smooth transition to David. You kind of think, okay, Saul dies, David becomes king. Well, it's not really, we'll talk about it, but it's not really that smooth. Okay? And maybe, David says earlier, he says, well, one of three things is going to happen to Saul. He's either going to die in battle, the Lord's going to take him, or he's going to die of old age. And at that point, David seemed willing, I'll wait till Saul dies of old age. Maybe that was the original plan. David's actions by going into the Philistines caused the terror in Saul, which made Saul go to the witch, which said, okay, fine, if this is how we're going to play it, this is how it's going to be, kind of thing. Okay? So I think it was just a one-off event here for Saul's benefit. That same night they got up and left. Moving into chapter 29. I don't know if anybody's noticed this, but we've already gone through 2 chapters. This is like a land speed record for me. I just want to just point that out. Okay. So Saul gets up and goes, and to a certain extent, I wanted to use this thing. I wanted to call this, Saul's finest hour, because knowing what he knows, he goes to battle anyway, kind of thing, But I titled this one, Desperate Men Do Desperate Things. David is desperate, so he runs to the Philistines. Saul is desperate, so he runs to a witch, kind of thing. Saul goes back, and it's certainly, Saul rises to the occasion and is going to die. Jonathan, again, I've talked about Jonathan before. Jonathan knows this isn't going to end well. I can't believe that, Saul was real perky and excited and enthusiastic about the battle, and yet Jonathan and his 2 brothers go into this battle as well. Meanwhile, any questions? I should stop. Anyone? Okay. Meanwhile, verse 29, the Philistines gathered all their forces at Aphek. They've moved since chapter 28. And Israel camped by the spring in Jezreel. As the Philistine rulers marched with their units of hundreds and thousands, David and his men were marching at the rear with Achish. The commanders of the Philistines asked, what about these Hebrews? This may be the first time that these other rulers, remember the Philistines have like 5 major cities, okay, and this is like a big battle, right? And they can't help but notice, because they know where their king is, and they can't help but notice, hey, wait a minute, there's this group of 600 Hebrews here. What about these Hebrews? Who are these guys? What are they doing here? We're going to go fight them. Why are they in the midst? Okay. Achish replied, is this not David, who was an officer of Saul, king of Israel? He's already been with me for over a year, and from the day he left Saul until now, I have found no fault in him. He trusts David. Now, we know he's been lied to. I have found no fault in him. Okay? Not like, Pilate's, I find no fault in Jesus. But, okay? I find no fault in him. But the Philistine commanders were angry with Achish and said, send the man back that he may return to the place you assigned him. He must not go with us into battle, or he will turn against us during the fighting. Now, what on earth would make the Philistines think this is going to happen? Does anybody remember 1 Samuel 14? This is when Saul's first battle against the Philistines. Okay, Saul comes in and he's doing great. And the text tells us in 1 Samuel 14, verse 24, that all those Hebrews that had gone over to the Philistines, when they saw that the Israelites were winning, turned against the Philistines. Okay, that's in 1 Samuel 14. And when we went through that, I said, mark that, remember that, we're going to come back to it. Okay, so maybe the Philistine commanders have a better memory than Achish does. Okay, maybe Achish is new to the job. I don't know. Okay, he's certainly not investigating David very much. I think if I were the king, I would send a couple of my own guys in with this. Hey, you go with this guy while he's fighting all those Israelites down there, but he doesn't. Okay, so the Philistines are gathering up, but not everyone wants David. Achish vigorously defends having David with him, saying, I have found no fault in him. The commanders think differently and demand David be sent back. Why? Perhaps the commanders have a better memory than David's, than Achish. Okay, remember that song? How better, he must not go with us into battle, or he will turn against us. How better could he regain his master's favor by then taking the heads of our own men? Well, he's not that far from the king now, is he? Right? They've got a point. Okay? Isn't this the David they sang about in their dances? Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. So Achish called David and said to him, as surely as the Lord lives, you have been reliable, and I would be pleased to have you serve with me in the army. From the day you came to me until today, I have found no fault in you, but the rulers don't approve of you. Now, again, this kind of, we're not dealing with an absolute ruler here, but now turn back and go in peace. Do nothing to displease the Philistine rulers. Okay, I mean, Achish is apologizing to David. David, I'm so sorry. Listen, if it was up to me, you'd be with me. It'd be a glorious day, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe Achish had these ideas that he would they would put David in as like a puppet ruler, and they would get a lot of tribute from him, and everything would be great. Maybe that's Achish's plan. Okay, but he's apologizing. Listen, okay, it's not going to go the way I thought it was going to go. David's like, but what have I done? Asked David. What have you found against your servant from the day I came to you until now? Why can't I go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king? Okay. But not before proclaiming his innocence. Achish says in verse 9, I know that you have been as pleasing in my eyes as an angel of God. I'm wondering if this is like, if David's thinking of all the men and women that he killed just so that nobody could get back to Achish when he's being told this. I don't know. So, nevertheless, the Philistine commanders have said he must not go up with us into battle. See, I think David's absolute intention was to turn on Achish. Okay? I mean, it's as clear as day. I mean, again, I have the benefit of, 3,000 years hindsight. But I think that's pretty clear what had David plot was. That's what David's plot was. And at this point, here you have God preserving David because like this isn't going to work. This isn't going to work. Okay. He must not go out. Now go up early along with your master's servants who have come with you and leave in the morning as soon as it's light. So David and his men got up early in the morning to go back to the land of the Philistines. So apparently he has crossed over back into Israel, and the Philistines went up to go to Jezreel. So Achish likens David to being as pleasing as an angel of God. That's how I usually describe Debbie. She's as pleasing as an angel of God. She describes me as an old man wearing a robe. Intelligent and beautiful, surly and mean. There's 100 of these kind of thing. David obeys Achish and returns to Ziklag, his hometown, where he left his wives and family, as did everyone else. When he got there, he found, well, we'll talk about that next week. What happens when he gets back to Ziklag? Any questions? Yes. It could, yeah. I think it that would be. He's going to be dead. I think is what he means specifically. Whether that's in heaven or not, I don't know. I would assume he's dead. I mean, I think Saul had a lot of time to really contemplate what was going on here and what he had decisions he had made in his life. And, you know, Jonathan goes and fights in chapter 14, where he takes on a battle, and he says, perhaps the Lord will bless us. You know, and you see that a couple of times. Maybe Saul said, well, maybe the Lord is going to bless me. So the question is, when Samuel says you'll be with me, does he mean you'll be with him in heaven or just dead? I think he just means you're going to be dead at that point. Anything else? Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you very much for coming. 3 chapters today. How about that? 3 chapters. That's, you know, we may finish the book of Samuel before next year after all. All right, next time we'll finish, I hope, my plan is to finish the book of Samuel, or 1 Samuel, and we'll talk about the death of Saul. So, thank you very much. See you next week.